good, everyone? My name is Austin Ashe, and I am on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.
Welcome back, everybody, for another amazing, of course, episode of the Chopping Block. Thank you all for being with us, whether you are watching us on YouTube or Vimeo, or whether you're listening through any of your streaming services. We have a delight for you today. I'm here with my brother, my man,
my guy,
one of the few guys who came to check me out when I came back home to Massachusetts, soon to be Dr. Austin Ashe. Brother Ashe, how you doing, man?
Sherrod, I'm doing great, man. It is always a joy and a gift to see you. And so I'm just happy to be here, happy to catch up, to chop it up.
Chop it up.
So just happy to be here, man. I'm good.
Thank you for being here, man. And thank you for carving out some space. I'm here in Tucson, you're in Massachusetts. We got, at this point in time, at the time of this recording, we got a 2-hour difference. So thank you for carving out some space. Austin, currently you are and it's a little bit of a lengthy title, you are the Senior Associate Director, Belonging and Culture, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan School of Management. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that is precise.
I've had my fair share of lengthy titles as well, so I get it. But you're also an adjunct professor at Bunker Hill Community College.
Yeah, that is, I'm happy to talk about that. That has been such a joy to kind of have adjacent to my full-time position is to teach at Bunker Hill, a great community over there.
Without a doubt. We're definitely gonna dig into that shortly. But I want to kick it off just somewhat, before I kick it off, actually, to the questions from the door. It's been a while, so I just gotta ask you, I had another hip hop head on recently who really provided some good insight, Dr. Eric House. And I got to start with you the same way I started with him. What's your take on the current state of hip hop?
I thought you were going to ask me for a top 5 or something. Softball. What is my current, what do I think about the current state of hip hop? That's murky waters, but not as murky as we think. I think the current state of hip hop is very healthy. And it depends on when you say hip hop, right? Are we talking about music or are we talking about the culture as a whole?
Good, yeah.
Right? So if we're talking about music, I still think it's healthy. If we're talking about the culture, I still think it's actually healthy. The music is different though, right? Like sonically, we are faced with the challenge of being prescribed like certain music through radio, right? Mm-hmm. And so radio has its own agendas in respect to what they play, how frequently they play it, and what messages they're trying to send out. And I don't listen to the radio that much anymore because the messages that I'm hearing don't reflect the core of what hip hop began as, which is sharing our narratives about our lived conditions.
Yes.
Right. Truthfully, like there's still some of that, right? Like some of that stuff breaks through. However, I don't think that is on as a dominant presence on mainstream radio like it used to, like in the 80s and 90s when Hot 97 and West Coast, like these pillars of radio and pillars of hip hop were, doing their due diligence to share the message.
Right.
With that said, so mainstream hip hop is kind of what everyone hears. However, I think, to use the analogy of crate digging, I think you have to dig in the crates to find out, to discover like where that hip hop, where the true essence of hip hop is living right now.
Right.
And so the beauty of streaming services is that, right, randomly given like their different like how how they suggest music to you, right?
Right. The
Through,
algorithms there.
yeah, that's I was like, what's that word? The algorithms, right? You know, you might discover some new folks. Like I've discovered plenty of new people. I was just listening to some Mac Homie the other day, Haitian cat, who's running with Griselda, I believe. And so I've never heard of the guy. And music's incredible, like talking about the state of Haiti, a place that I don't really know that much about beyond what I see in the news. So, so that's just one example. And I think streaming services have allowed for independent creation. And so whatever your story is, you can get it out there, generate a following without the label, right? Being a slave to the label. And I use that word intentionally, right?
Right, sure.
Because we know the history of people getting jerked around with bad deals. So,
right.
So I do think that it is healthy. I worry somewhat about the next generation, about what they are consuming. However, hip hop is a youth culture and driven by youth culture. And so they're only going to be as good as our ability to reach back. So reaching.
I like that.
So, so if we're doing our due diligence to reach back, I think the state of hip hop in its entirety will be fine and will remain fine and true to the essence.
I can appreciate that. I admittedly struggle, and my man Iggy gives me grief about this often. He's not entirely wrong. I'll never tell him that. So if he's listening, that's your one you get from me. But like some of us old heads have a habit of sort of living so much in the past that we don't give today enough credit. You talked about how it's healthy and such, and I'm notorious for that across the board. My favorite athletes are going to come from back in the day, right? I'm looking at the Jordans, right, the Larry Birds, etc. My favorite wrestlers still from the Attitude Era, right, back in the day. We're not looking at today. You know, and same with my rappers. I want to, if I remember correctly, you and I share a favorite rapper of all time, or so it's Nas.
Nas, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So. Right. And, you know, for many of the reasons you talked about, you want to talk about someone who not just stated it, but eloquently stated what was going on around him in story mode, and somebody who, if was given the quill, if you will, I think could also, you know, today put out something that was revolutionary in a way that moved younger folk, if that was something he was driven to do. Right. So there's a lot to unpack in there, and we'll come back around shortly when we talk a little bit about some of the classes you're teaching, or at least one of the classes you're teaching. But let's go back to the beginning a little bit.
Yeah.
Born and raised in Connecticut, West Haven. I looked at the population, at least as of 2021, and we see that West Haven is 63% white, and 20% Black by contrast of those two particular identities. Was this a similar makeup when you were growing up? And if so, how did your experience growing up in a majority white space shape how you saw the world moving forward?
Yeah, so I grew up in West Haven, but I didn't grow up in a predominantly white space. And so we lived in what were called the Meadowbrook apartments. And so a little nook of West Haven that was probably predominantly Black, Latino, and Asian. So I mean, plenty of white folks, but I mean, we were definitely the majority. And so middle to low to middle class, right? But lots of, it was in, you know, I grew up in the 80s. And so it was a time where people really looked out for one another. And, you know, a lot of my father was, you know, my dad was not in the picture. And so I hung around with a lot of the, you know, older kids and older heads for knowledge, and, you know, and got into some trouble here and there and all of that kind of good stuff. But, so I didn't grow up in a predominantly white space. However, education, my mom would, you know, always hark on this comes first. And I will just say that my grandmother, God rest her soul, lived in a part of West Haven that that basically sent, like, she was just in a district that the children from that school went to a different public school.
Okay.
So I'll say that.
Yeah.
So so I had dual citizenship, and so we'll say that. And I ended up at Pagels Elementary, which was a predominantly white school. And I talk about some of this in my research. And so growing up, you know, and I was, before we, you know, got on, I was talking about Du Bois, right? And that double consciousness, right? That strong sense that I am Black, right? From 8 or 7, from the moment I wake up to when I get to school is different, right? Because I'm in my bubble, in my Black and brown Asian community.
Right.
School, I'm the Black kid.
Right.
Right. That's different.
Right.
And so navigating those systems, even as a young cat, right, it was something I was hyper aware of, because I was shy. I was mad shy growing up.
Sure.
And I didn't really talk much, and they thought I had like a speech problem.
Right.
Right. And so my experience was they were looking at me through a different lens, and it's like, yo, I'm just not messing with y'all like that.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so my experience was different because of that. And over the years, there was you know, I seriously had to wrestle with, like, does being successful mean being closer to whiteness, right? Is it a proximity thing? And so I grew up with these questions, right? And still very proud of my mother and my grandmother, who are, you know, to this day, some of my biggest inspirations.
Right.
But there was something there, right? That, like, if I am in these spaces, I have possibly a higher chance to be successful, which, right, that's how they socialized me.
That's right.
Right. And so I didn't really break free of that until like probably the middle of high school. And so I had while I was at home, I had my Black friends, but I would go to, you know, the other part of town and hang with those cats for the summer, just like kind of living in two worlds.
Right.
Because I wanted like, I loved my friends at home, but I'm like, yo, like, I'm like, if I hang with these cats, like, I'll be able to join like the football team or the big, like, there was, you know, some
privilege
capital there.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So so yeah, so it was very different. I broke through of that in high school when I made the decision that I wanted to go to college and have a bit of a different experience and meet different people. So so it was my experience growing up in West Haven was very much one of feeling of dual citizenship because of how I was socialized.
Makes total sense. You know, and I think about just my experience in Massachusetts, Boston, you know, when I moved around the country later on in life, you know, a lot of folks were like, wait, the Black Bostonian, never seen one. I know that was a real thing. Yeah. Well, the city's 25% Black, actually, right? And although 25% Black means that it's 75% something else, you know, in a country where the population is 13.4% Black, that's a lot of people in a concentrated area, given the numbers at large. And so, you know, 20%, you know, for the folks who are not coming from Black communities, make no mistake about it. I mean, that's a decent number of Black folks in a given space, especially in the Northeast, especially in New England. And so it stands to reason why you would have sort of a dual experience given the demographics as well. Sticking within Connecticut, you went on to receive your bachelor's from Quinnipiac, and then you went and got your master's from Springfield College in Massachusetts. Was higher ed always the goal for you?
No. I didn't know what my goal was.
Okay. Try to figure it out as you, like most of us did, right? Yeah.
So I came into Quinnipiac, right? Also a predominantly white space, but I was able to identify some incredible friends that, we called ourselves basically like the United Nations, because we had from every part of the parts of the diaspora, Asian Pacific Islander areas, right?
Yep.
So anyways, so I went to Quinnipiac. I thought so I majored in communications. I thought I was going to be on ESPN or like on MTV, right, when they showed videos,
right? Yeah.
So,
right.
And so that's not a realistic career goal, as was told to me by, certain people, my mother, grandmother, right? And so at some point I stuck with that, because I actually I came this close to having my own show. I auditioned for something on MTV, and it came, I was going to go to New York and like possibly sign something. But it never happened.
Fell through.
That's another conversation for another time.
Right.
However, in the middle, I think around my sophomore year, I had this incredible psychology professor, and just the way he thought about people and like why people are motivated to behave in certain ways fascinated me. And so I added psychology as my second major. And so my thread kind of led me there. I was also super involved as a student, and the combination of understanding people through the lens of psychology and being a student leader and working with folks in ways to motivate them to, be their best selves or be curious, was something that I always enjoyed doing. So I was an orientation leader, I was on BSU, I was on a bunch of others, right? And so I didn't really come to higher education as a viable career goal until I spoke with two of my mentors. One, her name is Cheryl Barnard, and two, Manuel Carrero, who has since passed away a few years ago. Great man. And they said, "Why aren't you interested in higher education?" I'm like, "Wait, oh, you do this and you get paid for this."
Right.
Maybe. I'm like, yeah, I think I would enjoy this. So I ended up last minute applying to Springfield, I think in like April. And I mean, you know how, so they had a rolling mission, thankfully. And I was able to meet with their program director, loved her. Her name's Delight Champagne. I mean, you can't really go wrong there.
What the heck? Solid.
Right. So, and ended up in a career of higher ed. I spent 2 years at Springfield, became very interested in issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and the student experience and the staff experience, and then subsequently graduated. But my leadership experience at Quinnipiac led me to Springfield, and Springfield really opened up the gates for me through my grad studies and also like certain professional development activities.
What's up, man? We when I was in college, we played Springfield, I think one time, got smacked. Some big boys, but that's my running with them. But I feel you on your journey to higher ed. Your master's is in what we would have called HESA, higher education, so student administration or student affairs, as is mine. I was actually pitched it. It was pitched to me as a residence life degree. Hey, you should, go to this program. You get a residence life degree. What the heck? I was an RA for 1 year. So I was like, oh, well, I know what that is, right? So sometimes we kind of stumble upon things. And some of the advice I try to give the youth of today, and we're going to talk about your role with the youth shortly, is, folks who are undecided trying to figure out, what do I do in college? I let them know I didn't know what I wanted to do for a career until I was 25.
Yeah, no framework.
No framework. I was just floating. And it wasn't until I got to my master's program, literally my decision to get an advanced degree, what I thought was res life degree. The first game we played in class was student affairs Scrabble. Student affairs categories. And through that game, I got to see all of the offices and units that were inside of student affairs, like DEI, like admissions, like Res Life. And I said, wow, I can do a bunch of these things. So a lot of times it's just coming to it.
Mm-hmm.
We talked offline about this idea of hip hop ed.
Yeah.
For the listeners who don't know, what is it? What is hip hop ed?
Yeah, I'll the answer I want to give is a lot longer, but I will say hip hop ed is basically a cultural educational movement, right? That seeks to introduce elements of hip hop, all the cultural elements of hip hop, right? So not just emceeing, DJing, breaking, graffiti, and knowledge of self, right? Mm-hmm. But also ways of speaking, ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of dressing, like, you know, anything that has to do with hip hop, incorporating those elements, right? How we understand ourselves through a hip hop lens into the field of teaching, right? And so looking at content, but also looking at pedagogy, right? Yeah. And looking at making decisions on pedagogy and making larger decisions about the curriculum. And in a lot of ways, and historically, hip hop has been described as kind of a culturally relevant or a culturally sustaining approach to teaching. Mm-hmm. And now it's kind of become more than that, because it informs how we build relationships with students, how we view our institutions, how education could be constructed to be especially important for these current times as a tool of resistance for students. Yeah. And so I'll say that, right? It is incorporating hip hop culture in ways that displace what is a historically problematic educational system. The research, a lot of research for hip hop ed, the foundation has been laid in K through 12, mm-hmm. right? And so, and has now evolved to incorporate more things, right? Higher education is probably a growing area of interest, but still heavily rooted in K through 12.
Yeah, without a doubt. Even when you start talking about policy as well, mm-hmm. My PhD, the program is education and leadership and policy, and within that is a lot of discussion around K-12. They'll try to go to K-20, but that K-12 element is there, which is important, which will come up shortly. Talk about your research a little bit. You examine, and I want you just to expound on this for me, but you're examining sort of the experience of Black faculty that practice hip hop ed in higher education, and sort of trying to engage what that approach means in terms of, as you call, sort of emancipatory power.
Yeah.
Expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I mean, this is all this stuff is connected, Gerard, the stuff that we've been talking about, right? This dual citizenship idea, this double consciousness idea, right? So socially, the cultural systems that I have navigated and survived, right? Higher education, graduate education, even working as a professional, like all these spaces I've worked in or been in have been predominantly white spaces. And so I'm going to tell you a story about kind of how I arrived at my research, right? Please. And kind of what it is.
Please.
So I wasn't aware of how powerful white dominance, whiteness was working on me as a professional, right? And so for years, I've worked at a number of institutions. I've been in higher ed for probably about 15 years, give or take. That is a long time not to be aware of something, right? Like I considered myself a disruptor, and and had worked on issues related to race, equity, and inclusion, like throughout higher ed. However, in the background, I'm still being conditioned to think of things through the lens of whiteness. Like, even if it means
Yes.
disrupting things, I'm like, what's the whiteness way to disrupt something, right?
Yes. Right. Yep.
So, so I arrive at Bunker Hill Community College of Mass. I am a first or second year PhD student at this point, and I am teaching a course called Hip Hop in America. So, you know, I'm excited about the coursework. You know, I got a whole syllabus planned. Everything is great. I'm like, this is going to be the best class these students ever have. Like, that's what I'm going in thinking, right? Super prepared. We have a good first class. I'm like, you know, kind of warm and cold. Like, you know, some students really excited about the content, but, you know, some others weren't. And then 2-3 weeks go by and I'm like, yeah, I'm really not getting interaction with like a significant piece of the students, right?
Right.
So I'm thinking deeply about this. I'm like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? I'm like, well, they must be disinterested. And then I came across, I was you know, trying to find my dissertation topic, right? Like, what's the problem I'm looking at? So I was looking at some work by Jangle Paris and Sammy Alim, or Alim. I forget how his last name is pronounced, but they're doing some research in culturally relevant, culturally sustained pedagogy, along with some Latson Billings and bell hooks. Like, I'm reading through this.
Sure.
Right. And so I had this moment, I'm like driving in my car thinking about the class, like on my way to my next class, my fourth class. Man, these students. And then I'm like, yo, I'm the problem. I'm the problem.
Dawned on you.
Yeah. So I'm sitting there thinking about all of the things that I've been reading, right? Centering the student's culture, the importance of translation, the importance of liberatory classrooms, right? For, you know, Paulo Freire stuff, like cultural circles, right? All of these things. I'm like, I'm doing none of these things in my practice, right? So I pull up to the class, and I'm like, what am I, you know, now, you know, I'm still in the like, I had a revelation. So I'm like, I don't know what to do.
Right.
Sitting in my car, I'm like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to approach this? I did two things differently, just to start off.
Yeah.
I walked into the classroom, and I would try to call the class to order because I thought it was disordered, right? The students are having conversations, they're building relationships. I see that, you know, prior to this, like, as y'all are getting in the way of the lesson. However, what I needed to know is that they were doing the work of building relationships with each other, right? And it was my mistake not to jump in and lean into that, right?
Reimagining the pedagogy in some senses of a classroom, how it should be conducted.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
So I don't call the class to order. And then, right, like at some point, like 10-15 minutes later, right, in Bunker Hill is the most diverse place I've ever taught at / worked at.
Right.
So like, yo, how come you're not convening the class? I'm like, I had a copy of the syllabus and I threw it in the trash. I'm like, yo, my bad. Listen, so, and I was just honest with them. I'm like, you know, because I come in as, you know, I used to be a graffiti writer, all these things. And so I had marketed myself in ways that was not reflecting the way that I was teaching, right? Or how I thought I should teach. And so whiteness was working on me, or what I thought I had to be as an academic was working, right? And so I said, we're going to do this collaboratively. What do y'all want to do with the next like 6 or 7 weeks of this class? And long story short, Sherrod, like, things got infinitely better, right? They were more engaged. I had more material on topics that were relevant to them, artists that were relevant to them, And then that gave me energy, that they had energy. So I'm like, let me dig for different stuff, right? Let me discover some things. And the last 6 or 7 weeks were incredible.
Yeah.
The last week, one of the quietest students who didn't really say much did like 2-3 minute freestyles, because he was a rapper. Like these are things that he never talked about leading up to the end of the class. And then he just breaks out with this freestyle talking about his life, his, juggling jobs, trying to be a student, trying to go to a 4-year institution, like killing it. All of the things that we see as outside of the scope of the class.
Yep.
But like the students were most engaged when he was the teacher, right? Like,
wow.
He felt most validated when he was teaching, right? And so I brought that to the next time I taught the course. We did a lot of, I'm going to sit down and y'all are going to give a presentation on hip hop as a resistance, right? Teach the class, right? Giving them a framework, right? Because that's been my responsibility, but letting them share the knowledge that they bring into the classroom. And so my research looks at what happened to me, right? And asks the question, does this happen to other Black faculty in higher education?
Yep.
And I'm specifically interested in faculty that practice hip hop ed. If hip hop ed was like a response, or kind of like they went into this originally with like this approach, and like how hip hop ed has the power to free us from the constrictions of what we think good teaching and what good scholarship and good research is. So I use Du Bois's double consciousness as kind of a conceptual framework where we have Black identity and faculty identity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can picture a DNA double helix, right? Mm-hmm. And you know how they twirl around each other. And so my conceptual framework looks at these two identities and hip hop ed as kind of the binding proteins in the middle, right? A pedagogical bridge between the two identities.
I like that.
And over time, do those two identities become more of a straight line because, and thanks to hip hop ed, like, because you are teaching from an epistemological framework that reflects who you are culturally, the legacy of your ancestors, and decenters whiteness, and centers collaborative learning and liberatory practices and practices that are meant to emancipate people. Do those two identities become closer over time? And what do those moments, like what are the critical linchpin moments that are involved with those two identities become closer together? So that's essentially what my research looks at. It's a qualitative study where I'll be doing interviews with faculty that practice hip hop ed.
And I can already see that being super transformative, and the ways in which we receive the culture. I mean, it's making me think of, so I'll be completely transparent and honest. Hamilton came to Broadway, to Tucson not too long ago, and it was my first time seeing it or hearing the soundtrack or anything that had to do with Hamilton at all. Well, I know Hamilton, don't get me wrong, I'm a historian, just in general, but I'm 6 years late or whatever, and I was like, oh wow, I'm blown away in the audience, and everyone else is singing along. I'm like, oh, I had no idea. I'm not a huge musical guy, but I had a feeling I was going to be able to connect in one way or another because there's a hip hop element to it. And the fact of the matter is, I was able to digest, even if I wasn't, versed to a degree in history and in legal studies, et cetera, I would have been able to digest the message just because it was presented in hip hop form, really, in a way that I was able to have access to. I had a conversation yesterday about some of these things. And in order to, when we talk about some of the disparities, remember, we're also acknowledging that there's an access point that folks need to have, or that folks don't have, that's causing these disparities. And maybe one reason why someone can't understand the material is because it's being presented to them in a language, if you will, that does not resonate. Which brings me to your current role at MIT. Talk about what you do in this role, and to what degree you still serve the undergrads, because that you're a former role of yours was really associate director of undergraduate education, and listening to you talk, I have to imagine that there is, what word do I want? It's important to ensure that the youth and folks who are at the undergraduate level in this case have access to these conversations early on. Now, my question to you was, what do you do in your role currently? And then how much are you still able to work with undergraduate students?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question first. So my role really is to look at our institution as a whole, right? And figure out what are the elements we need to incorporate in our work that make people feel that they belong, and what can we do from understanding our school as a cultural system, right? To make sure that people like that we can create a feeling of belonging, a feeling of inclusion, a feeling where people feel that there is equity, and that there are systemic ways that we are looking at diversifying our population in right and responsible ways, because we just don't want to bring people into a school where they're going to look around and say, something's not right here. Or it doesn't seem that they're working on anything that is related to equity and inclusion and anti-racism and all of these things, right? And so, taking a very data-driven systemic approach to creating cultures of inclusion and belonging. So that is like my general focus. Some of the central things I'll be working on is the introduction and sustaining of a what we are calling an open and inclusive training program, series of workshop discussions around, right, like how to create environments of psychological safety so that people can talk through about and through difference, and
Yes.
about and through issues related to a lot of the systemic societal problems that we have going on here today. But also, right, like not to just look at things from a lens of problems, but like the beauty and the strength of having a diverse community, the fact that we're smarter together when we are more diverse, right?
Right.
So the training, the series of workshops will look at that. How do we create that? 4 workshops. We're finalizing the content right now. And essentially what will happen is that people will go through this training, and then we'll be able to actually become the trainers. And right, so it becomes an embedded fabric into the Sloan experience, where we have ambassadors for this process, and we can say, this is who we are, and if you want to be part of our community, here is a 4-part experience where you can learn about how to be successful here, and how to create successful relationships. So so that's the ethos of the work. That is very staff and faculty facing, but there is also a student component to it, because a lot of this stuff will impact students, right?
Of course.
Curriculum wise, advising wise, et cetera. My last role, as you had mentioned, was with undergrad. And with undergrad, I was able to, thanks to the great colleagues I had, their names are Scott and Natalie, they're just incredible people. Was able to dabble in a lot of things, committees that were DEI focused, initiatives, conversations, creating space for people especially as we are losing so many, right? We had lost so many Black lives over the past few years, arranging what I ended up calling MIT ciphers about these issues. Like my colleagues allowed me to experiment with these things. So that kind of led me to this role. My undergrad role was really just focused on creating community for undergraduates. And so while that is not necessarily the focus, the super focus of my role, I find all of those things interconnected, because if our staff are better, our faculty better, our undergraduate students have a better experience. I am still connected to our office. Like my old office, we're literally about 50, 100 feet away. And I consider them great thought partners on, right, like how can we make this institution better, because our undergraduates are going to leave and be leaders in such and such fields. And I have the responsibility from a programmatic standpoint to supply them with speakers, workshops, conversations that will help them, right? Schools like Sloan help the world go round, right? Or make the world go round. We want to make sure it's spinning in the right direction.
Without a doubt. And powerful. It resonates with me because I consider myself what I call a system-centered researcher. My focus is on organizational design and behavior, and I'm interested in the ways in which designs or systems impact the behaviors or attitudes of the people within them. You know, the idea of if you see a child who's behaving in a particular way, someone's question might be, what kind of household is it coming from? Like, how's it being run here? Your focus immediately goes to the structure. So when you're talking about culture, which is in your title, I love the fact that you acknowledge faculty, staff, and students, all composites of this larger thing that we acknowledge to be culture, this environment, and sort of those laws of behaviors, which I won't go into now, but this, you know, the larger sort of system and ecosystem here that is in many ways DEI, or an inclusive space. We're pressing up on time here. I got a couple of questions, but I got to get at least 2 more in if I can.
Yeah, go. I'm here, man.
So there's an old adage. Let's see if I want to start. There's an old adage that I'm fond of. I've come across in the work of DEI. I use pretty often when I try to highlight racial issues, and I'm sure you might be familiar with this as well. This idea of once we resolve race, everything else falls in place. Especially unique to the U.S. because of how latticed race is into the fabric of who we are, in terms of the country's founding on paper, right, and framework in 1776 and on. I'm not necessarily talking about beforehand when we're talking about indigenous land, although that's a part of the conversation as well. But to keep it within context, earlier you talked about, or you alluded to, maybe what I should say is what I gleaned from what you were saying was the importance of naming things, systems or structures that are problematic, as a way to not engage in a Eurocentric approach to doing the work, or seek dismantle. I guess my question to you is, how much of the work of, or how much is the naming of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how much does that actually get in the way of real racial and social justice work? When you mask it under DEI, is that a white way of going about what we need to be doing, which is like racial and social justice work?
That is a great question, Sherrard. I think one of the critical things in social justice work is the art of translation. I really do, and I think we know that we need, to some degree, the capital and power and influence and ideas, not to reframe everything, not to reframe the efforts of the people of color like us who have been working on these problems for so long. But we need white people, right? To work on this stuff with us and to use their capital when it makes sense and to speak with us, especially if they're labeling themselves as advocates and allies and these things, right? So we need them to do that, especially since they have, just numbers wise, certain seats at the table that we do not have representation at yet.
Right.
And so if framing things in like using the word DEI versus anti-racism or decolonization, or right, like critical race theory, right? We need to be, I don't want to be, however, in certain cases, we need to be bridge builders and translators.
Sure.
And so if that's going to get somebody over the bridge, then I'm okay with utilizing DEI to describe all of these other things that are more poignant and more specific.
Sure.
And then making those specific connections to anti-racism, critical race theory, what it means to be an ally, what it means to be a disruptor, as we move along, right? Reach and teach, as I was referencing others.
Right.
We need to reach these folks first. However, I do see the DEI as a term being problematic, because people can just say, hey, we've got a DEI office, like check.
Right. Yep.
And so if we, and so that the mistake that is made there is that they don't pay attention to, right? A lot of companies, organizations will focus on diversity. So that is numeric, right?
Sure.
Equity is policy, right? We can frame policy, we can do that. That's non-nebulous-ish or less nebulous. But inclusion, like the feeling that you belong to a place, is a little different. So like, I think inclusion is the apex, right? That is where all of this stuff is driven. And so we need to remind our peers, our friends, our people that like inclusion is like, that's the goal. It's not just three things that have equal relationship to one another. They're definitely related in my eyes, right? But inclusion is the goal, right? And so anything less than that, I think we're falling short. And I do think, right, there are certain organizations that are like, yeah, I'm really interested in this diversity work, but inclusion, whoa, yeah, I'm not about that life, right? Because that means I need to change my behavior, right? And so conversations that I've had with colleagues, past faculty, we can talk about recruiting, right? And there's just not a pipeline, or we found a few folks. The process is that we're doing blind resume reading and everything, all of that. Like that's also I have a whole TED talk on, not official, but whole TED talk on right? Because if I don't know if that last name is Johnson, right? Like I don't know if that person's getting in, right?
Yep.
So, but that I kind of digress. Inclusion is the apex, and we need to bring that to the center. So that is not just, it should be IDE or DIE, or not DIE. That would be a little different. But you get what I'm saying.
You sound like me. Yeah.
But if inclusion is not the goal, then yes, it's easier to mask the work that actually needs to be done by just referencing things as this is a D&I initiative. So yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. It sounds, I hear you talking. I just hear my work. I'm like, wow, because I try to remind folks that there's an order of operations to this. It shows up slightly different, but our vision is the same. And one thing I try to tell people in the hiring process, for example, is that you can't do diversity without inclusion, and you can't do recruitment without retention.
Yes.
And if you think of diversity or recruitment as diversity, you think of retention as inclusion, or inclusion as retention. If you try to recruit folks without the measures in place to retain them, then you failed in your recruitment efforts. The fact of the matter is, research will show you that an individual's decision to retain anywhere in any kind of ship, personal relationship, intimate relationship, workplace relationship, friendship, etc., has everything to do with their sense of belonging, their sense of value. And if you're not retaining folks, then they're going to leave that particular situation for whatever reason makes sense to them. So inclusion needs to be at the core of what we're trying to do. And a lot of times inclusion it's intrinsic, has an internal sort of examination component to it in ways that diversity by itself doesn't really. It tends to be more external representation, or sort of sending a message. Inclusion, as you're eloquently saying, is forcing you and asking you to do the real work, which is internal. I want to hit you with one more question, Austin, and then we're going to wrap this up. I know you got to go. So,
I've got like 15 so minutes. So if you need, if you can squeeze 2 in, I'm happy to do that too.
Perfect. I'll keep an eye right on the time then, brother. I want to read you a piece of a quote here that I think you might recognize. I'm going to syncopate it a little bit for the sake of time. There's a difference between not guilty and not found guilty. The trial of this guy was a performance to the highest degree. I'd say the potential precedent this sets is dangerous until we fix some serious systemic issues in this country. November 19th, 2021, Facebook post by yours truly, brother Austin Ashe. This was in reference to the Rittenhouse case. Talk to me and to the audience a little bit about what was on your mind when you wrote this. And what do you see as the largest systemic, cultural, and social implications in what you referenced?
So, man, I didn't know you were going to pull out all these receipts, Gerard, but I expect nothing less, right? What that quote represents is, right, it is very emblematic of so many things that are going on today. So, we can talk about privilege, right? And the ability to see someone just because of what they look like, and he was just protecting himself, or he seems like a nice boy, right? And the people that will cape for them, right, and call this person a hero and give him interview times. This person murdered people. Multiple people. So, however, we live during a time, and this, not during a time, this has been historic,
right,
where people are consciously making the decision to not find somebody responsible for the injuries that they have caused when they went out looking to injure folks, right? And so in the disparity, right? I don't want to get into the trope of right, but I have to. If Kyle was Puerto Rican, or if he was Black, if he was from, Haiti, right? This story ends very differently, right? We dehumanize him. We call him a monster. We talk about, what's wrong with him, instead of, right, the things that we should be talking about. Why is he able to have an assault rifle walking down a street at a protest where he is obviously seeking to be an agitator, right? Across state lines, right? So it, again and again, we need to realize that we are working against a system that is choosing choosing whiteness first,
Right.
because like take the judge, for example. Oh my God, like,
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So many, right, from the judge, like how we appoint judges needs to change. How we enforce cross state line crimes needs to change. How we think about loss of life needs to change.
Yes.
And we don't talk about enough, right, that the people that lost their lives weren't people of color, right? They were white. So like y'all can get it too. Right.
Yeah,
Like that's what
that's
I
the
need my
message.
people to understand.
Yep.
Right. Like y'all can get it too. And we need to work together to dismantle some of these systemic issues, gun control, how courts operate and appoint judges like that. The trial was a bit of a circus. And so, but these are all cultural systems that are embedded in the fabric of this country, and it has been whiteness preserving, like the white right to preserve life first above everything else. And so we need to work on those things.
Wow, that was powerful. I can appreciate that big time. It leads me to, because we have the time, my final question for you. And I want to thank you again, Brother Austin, for taking some time out. I know you're in a pinch, and I really am grateful for you. Take this one wherever you want to go. I was brought into conversation recently. I cannot for the life of me remember with whom or when even. But the point the person was making was that integration has happened and is happening in many ways in the US, but it occurred and or is occurring without any real recognition or acknowledgement of the harms that existed before integration, so that led to integration and engaging in it. I'm going to ask a very stark question here, but is or was there actual real value in a segregated society for Black people? And let me couch this a little bit more.
Yeah.
My mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., one time showed a slide of all of the historical Black folks we know to be our leaders in cultural history. And he asked one question: what do all these folks have in common? From Dr. King to Malcolm X to Du Bois to James Baldwin to Toni Morrison to Nikki Giovanni, you name it. And the answer was they all were educated in a segregated society. So I pose the question back: is there value in that for Black folks?
Yes, I mean, emphatically, yes, there is value. I mean, there is, the first thing I think of, the first thing I thought of when you were framing that question for me is Black Wall Street, right? But also,
sure. Yeah,
right, that is the story that everybody knows, right?
Century ago, yeah.
Right, there are several different Black Wall Streets, right? That have, where Black folks were concentrated and building businesses and going to church and looking out for one another and thriving, right? Only to be interrupted by
maliciously.
The thought of, right, like of what I can only imagine is, well, what if these people become successful and equal, right? That is insane to me. It is insane. And so just for the preservation of life, it is necessary. It's necessary now. And we live in a society, maybe more so now than years ago, that was prepared for that. But right, we know that that racism operates it's a chameleon and will evolve to meet the needs to preserve white dominance and power. I think of HBCUs and the brothers that I meet that graduated from HBCUs and how they talk about their experience there as being, I mean, certainly more validating, but
Right.
they talk about education in a way that I think that has been lost, right? It
Yes.
is not for HBCUs. The act of educating is not a consumer driven process, or
Right.
right, like it is about empowering the students that are in the classroom
That's
spaces
right.
to be their best selves,
That's right.
right? That is something that I did not have.
Right.
And right, I'm like, damn, I should have went to an HBCU, right? Because a lot of the things that I was talking about earlier, right, I would have been able to just deconstruct a lot quicker, about how, even though I'm highly aware of the fact that I am Black in America, and how that my experience is different than other folks. Like, I'm highly aware of that. That's thanks to my mom, my grandmother,
Right.
the church that we went to. Also, like, a bit about the church, like HBCUs, a haven from the ills of outside. And
Right.
the one of the few places we have that talks about America not as the dream, as Coates describes it in Between the World and Me, right? Not as the dream, but as what it really is.
Yeah.
Right. And so so the church was like one of the few places, probably the first place that I, besides my mother and my grandmother, talked about America as problematic,
Right. Yeah.
or like in some cases hypocrisy. Like, I love living in this country, and I'm appreciative of the fact that we don't have to deal with certain issues that other people have to deal with in the world. Doesn't make it doesn't provide the argument for me to describe America as the dream, though. And so I think HBCUs, right, are an institution, again, we were talking about critical race theory a little bit, looks at the experience of living in America in a very critical, honest, and transparent way. And there is a reason when we see somebody who is commentating on CNN, or a Black leader that's head of a nonprofit, or some company, a lot of these brothers went to HBCUs, right? And that network is strong. And so to answer your question, I do think to some degree it is necessary, until we can think about how to be better to one another, how to pay teachers better, how to create equitable curriculum and culturally relevant curriculum K through 12, how to incorporate STEM and STEAM in the classroom, the arts, right? And creating spaces for students, right? Like, I made the mistake of creating spaces so that they can tell their stories and add knowledge to the classroom, because they are not a disruption, right? They are our future leaders of tomorrow. They are real people experiencing things. So I do think to some degree it is necessary. And the Obama in me, right, wants us to be able to live in a society where I can look across the table. My best friend in high school was Italian, a dude by the name of Mike Palumbo, right? You couldn't find two different people, but we loved each other, right?
Sure.
That's the dream, right? That is the dream, where we can all be here, and look across the table and show love, and not think about what I'm losing for showing love to another person, or fighting for them, right? Or recognizing them. So, so I do think it's needed in a lot of ways, and I'm still fighting for something a future that I may never see, that my son may see, right?
Yes.
So he doesn't have to worry about being pulled over, or he has to worry less about being pulled over.
Right. Which is, I couldn't agree more, is absolutely the goal of being able to live in yourself, your complete self, in a country that, in a world really, where that should be a human right first before a civil right, right? So the segregated society in the past we saw had worked in terms of education, and then today maybe it's not a segregated society, maybe it's caucused spaces of some fashion,
Yes.
or not using these identities as divisive, but as a way to celebrate who we are, and collectively as well as individually.
Before we head out, Sherrod, there's one thing, there's been one powerful thing that I'm incredibly grateful for, and so I just have to mention it.
Please.
So living in Boston, right? I've lived here for a nice chunk of my life, and so Boston has its history, right? Mm-hmm. Boston is also experiencing a bit of a renaissance where there are more people of color in positions of power, whether it be politics, nonprofit spaces, and education. There is a tide turning. Mm-hmm. So we need to keep our foot on the gas. And I think to your point, what has made a lot of this possible is the caucusing, right? Meeting together across disciplines, across industry, and figuring out, right, like, how do we help one another? I think that is incredibly important, that interdisciplinary thinking of, right, this is not just me with my company or me trying to do right and get money for my family. It's a cultural system that we need to work on together to break. And so meeting at the church, as a metaphor where we can feel safe to call things out and build together, I think that will be the linchpin of continued progress in cities like Boston.
Without a doubt. And I can really appreciate you stating that and acknowledging that shift that the city's gone through. Awesome. Before I let you go, how can people get in touch with you, man? Any websites, hashtags, @ on social media, publications?
Yeah. LinkedIn, linkedin.com. I think the /me, Austin Ashe. I think that is I think that's the link. You could also find me on Twitter, at AAA. So that's my 3 initials, AAA, S as in Sam, H as in Harry, E as in excellent. So at Twitter. So that's on Twitter. And those are probably my 2 preferred methods of communication. You could also email me at aashe@mit.edu if you want to talk any of this education stuff. So
perfect, brother. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of folks interested in hip hop ed specifically as we engage more. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for joining in for today's session on the podcast. Here we are with the chopping block. Sherrod Robbins, Austin Ashe, and you with the chopping block on visceralchange.org.